Underneath an abandoned bridge, a 6-year-old girl heard the menacing roar of motorcycles dangerously approaching. Hidden among the concrete pillars, she watched in horror as the millionaire who always helped her was violently cornered by a furious gang. "You rich people are the cause of all our problems," the bikers shouted as they dragged him relentlessly toward the edge of the bridge. In sheer despair, the girl cried out, "Let him go or you'll regret it." Everyone laughed cruelly at the threat of such a small child, until she grabbed a rusty iron pipe and did something that left them all completely stunned. Arthur Sterling considered the small ritual the most authentic moment of his week. Far from the sterile boardrooms where the futures of his vast fortune and the profitability of his stock portfolio were debated, there was a world of concrete and shadows beneath the city's main overpass. There, the noise of the cars overhead was a constant, anonymous symphony, a sound that to him represented the indifference of the metropolis. And it was there that he met Leah, the girl. 6 years old, with eyes that held the wisdom of an ancient soul, was a living reminder of the chasm that separated his reality from that of so many others. He knew the money he gave her, a few bills that barely made a dent in his cash flow, wasn't a solution but a gesture that kept him human. That afternoon, the autumn sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, but under the overpass, the light barely reached. Arthur parked his imported sedan a safe distance away, as he always did, and walked over with the warm sandwich and juice box in his hand. He wore an expensive and impeccable grey suit, an armor that seemed ridiculous in this setting of dust and decay. Leah was already waiting, sitting on a piece of cardboard as small and still as a statue. She never ran to meet him. She simply watched him approach, appraising him with a seriousness that broke Arthur's heart. He crouched down, extending the food. "Hey, Starlight," he said, his voice soft, a tone he reserved only for her. She took the package without a word, her thin, grimy fingers brushing against his for a brief instant. That touch was the most valuable dividend any of his investments could ever yield. As he watched her eat with a restrained veracity, Arthur was lost in thought. His fortune was an abstract entity, a growing number on computer screens. A collection of assets, properties, and financial instruments that guaranteed him a place among the wealthiest men in the country. He was a multi-millionaire whose life was managed by consultants. But here, before this child, he was nothing more than a man with a sandwich. He felt an almost obsessive need to protect her, a naivety his business partners would surely ridicule. They saw the world as a game of capital and power. He, in these moments, saw only the fragility and strength contained in such a small body. He knew the dangers of the city, but he believed his presence, his pure intention, created a kind of invisible shield. That's when the sound changed. The constant drone of traffic was ripped apart by a different noise, a deep and aggressive roar that vibrated through the ground. Leah stopped chewing, her body instantly tensing. Her eyes, once focused on the food, shot to the entrance of the space under the overpass. She knew every sound of this place, and that was the sound of predators. Before Arthur could comprehend the girl's sudden tension, silhouettes appeared against the late afternoon light. 6 motorcycles, dark and menacing, slid under the structure, forming a semicircle that blocked the only way out. The engines were cut one by one, and the ensuing silence was more terrifying than the noise. Burly men with hard faces and eyes heavy with resentment dismounted. The leader, an older man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, walked slowly toward Arthur. Hidden behind a concrete pillar, Leah watched, her small heart pounding uncontrollably. The man in the shiny car, her only source of hope, was cornered. The silence stretched like a wire pulled taut. Arthur felt his own heart hammer against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that echoed the raw fear starting to climb his throat. He, a man accustomed to controlling multi-million-dollar negotiations and entire boardrooms with a simple gesture or a well-placed word, was utterly powerless. His business instinct screamed at him to assess the situation, find an angle, offer a deal. He opened his mouth, thinking of mentioning the cash in his wallet, maybe even promising a larger sum, an investment in whatever business they wanted to start. But the leader's gaze silenced him. There was no greed in those eyes, not the avarice of a common thief. There was something deeper, more bitter, an old, solidified resentment. "Arthur Sterling," the man said, and the name sounded like an indictment. "The billionaire who builds skyscrapers and leaves people to rot. You thought you could come down here to our turf and play the Good Samaritan." Arthur frowned, confusion momentarily overriding his panic. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was just helping the girl." The leader spat the words, a scornful smirk twisting his lips. "You and your kind are all the same. Throw crumbs to clear your conscience. You build your fortunes on our ruins and then come down here to act like saints." He took a step forward, the smell of gasoline and fury hanging in the air. Factories close. Families lose everything, and whose fault is it? The recession? The market? No. It's the fault of men like you, who count your profits while we count pennies for bread. Behind the pillar, Leah held her breath. She didn't understand words like fortune or profit, but she understood the rage in that man's voice. It was the same anger she saw in the eyes of other people who lived on the streets, a cold flame that burned inside. The man in the nice car was the only person who looked at her without that flame, with eyes that seemed to see a real person, not a nuisance. And now, because of him, danger had come to her refuge. Two of the other bikers moved, grabbing Arthur's arms with brutal force. The expensive fabric of his suit wrinkled under their calloused fingers. He tried to pull away, but it was useless. "This is a misunderstanding," he insisted, his voice sounding weaker than he'd like. "We can talk. We can work this out." The leader laughed, a dry, joyless sound. "We're done talking, Sterling. We're done waiting for a justice that never comes. Tonight, we make our own." He nodded his head. "Take him!" Arthur's panic exploded into pure terror as they began to drag him. His leather shoes, which had walked on the most luxurious carpets in the world, now scraped through the dirt and trash under the overpass. They were taking him toward the edge, to the low concrete barrier that separated the structure from the drop to the dark, polluted river below. The reality of the situation hit him like a physical blow. They didn't want his money. They wanted him. They wanted to make an example of him. Leah watched, paralyzed, as the man's body was pulled like a doll's. She saw his feet scrambling for purchase, the expression of shock and disbelief on his face. The bikers lifted him onto the barrier, his body dangling precariously over the abyss. The girl knew, with the terrible certainty that only children possess, that she had only a few seconds to stop the one ray of light in her life from being swallowed by the darkness. Time seemed to fold in on itself. For Leah, hidden in the gloom, the world was reduced to the terrifying image of Arthur's body suspended over the void. The muffled sound of his struggle, the fabric of his suit jacket stretching dangerously, it all etched itself into her mind in slow motion. Fear was an icy claw in her chest, paralyzing her, pinning her to the ground. But then something stronger than fear pushed through. It was the flash of a memory, the man's kind smile, the warmth of the sandwich in her cold hands, the only voice that called her Starlight. Those small kindnesses were all her wealth, a treasure she could not allow to be stolen. A scream ripped from her throat, thin and high-pitched, but it cut through the tense air like a knife. "Let him go, or you'll be sorry." For a second, a shocked silence fell over the place. The bikers turned, their faces a mixture of surprise and confusion. Then disbelief gave way to scorn. The leader was the first to laugh, a harsh sound that echoed under the overpass. The others followed, their cruel laughter ricocheting off the concrete walls. They looked at the tiny figure emerging from the shadows, a wisp of a girl challenging a pack of wolves. "What did you say, little rat?" one of them mocked. "What are you gonna do? Bite our ankles?" Arthur felt a wave of even greater despair. His entire fortune, all his assets and property were worthless at that moment. He had dragged her innocence into his world of conflict. Now she was a target. "Leave her alone," he managed to shout, his voice raw with dread. "She has nothing to do with this." But they paid him no mind. The diversion was far too amusing. Humiliating a billionaire was one thing, but being threatened by a street kid was the height of irony for them. The leader turned back to Arthur. "See that, Sterling? Even the vermin you feed think they're brave. Time to show everyone their place." Those laughs, however, had an unexpected effect on Leah. They didn't intimidate her. On the contrary, they burned away the last trace of her fear and replaced it with a cold, determined fury. Her eyes scanned the ground around her, the territory she knew better than anyone. And then she saw it. Lying among bits of wood and plastic bags, a rusty, heavy iron pipe gleamed faintly in the dim light. It was part of some old plumbing, abandoned like everything else here. With an effort that made her small muscles protest, she grabbed it. The cold, rough metal filled her hands. It was heavy, awkward, but in that moment, it felt like an extension of her will. The bikers, still laughing and focused on their main prey, didn't notice the movement. They had made the mistake of underestimating her, of dismissing her as insignificant. As the leader gave the final order to throw Arthur into the river, Leah took a step forward, emerging completely from the shadows. Her eyes were no longer fixed on the men, but on the metal hearts of their machines. She raised the pipe, her face an impossible mask of resolve, and took aim at the gleaming chrome exhaust of the nearest motorcycle. There was no hesitation. With a grunt that was pure willpower, Leah lunged. The bikers saw her move, but their minds, clouded by arrogance, failed to register her intent in time. To them, it was just the last twitch of an insect before being crushed. But Leah's motion was precise, guided by a survival instinct sharpened by life on the streets. She didn't aim for the men, but for the machine. With all the force of her small body, she jammed the end of the iron pipe into the mouth of the nearest motorcycle's exhaust. The sound was metallic and flat, a clash of metal on metal that seemed insignificant at first. For an instant, nothing happened. The leader, his hand still raised to give Arthur the final push, turned his head with an air of irritation. Then, all hell broke loose. The hot engine, only recently shut off, still contained pressurized gases. The sudden blockage created a violent back pressure. There was a choke, a shudder that rocked the bike on its stand, and then a deafening detonation, a sharp, powerful blast, much louder than a gunshot, that reverberated under the overpass like caged thunder. A cloud of black, acrid smoke shot out sideways, and the exhaust pipe, ruptured by the pressure, split with a high-pitched shriek. The noise was so violent it echoed above the traffic. A mechanical cry for help the city couldn't ignore. The chaos was instantaneous. The bikers clapped their hands over their ears, stunned by the sound. The owner of the damaged bike let out a yell of rage, forgetting everything else to inspect the damage. The two men holding Arthur loosened their grip, instinctively turning toward the source of the explosion, and that was the only window Arthur needed. All his capital, his entire net worth accumulated over years of shrewd deals, could not have bought him a more perfect opportunity. Fear gave way to a surge of adrenaline. He twisted with a strength he didn't know he possessed, driving his elbow hard into one man's stomach. The man grunted and doubled over, and Arthur used the momentum to wrench himself free from the other, landing hard on the dirt floor. He didn't wait to see what would happen. Ignoring the sharp pain in his shoulder, he scrambled and then ran, stumbling and staggering, away from the nightmare. Every step was propelled by the distant but unmistakable sound of approaching sirens. The girl's desperate plan had worked. That small, brave investment of kindness he made every week had just paid him the greatest dividend of all, his own life. When he reached a safe distance, Near the street, he stopped, breathless, and looked back. His heart plummeted. The bikers, realizing the sirens were getting closer and their main prize had escaped, began to panic. But panic quickly curdled into a concentrated, venomous rage. Their revenge on the system, personified by Arthur, had been thwarted, and the one to blame was standing there in the middle of the chaos she had created. The gang leader, his face red with fury, turned slowly. His eyes, once fixed on Arthur, now found Leah's. The humiliation of being outsmarted by a rich man was one thing. Being defeated by a dirty, forgotten child was unbearable. They couldn't get Arthur anymore, but they could take their rage out on who was left. Leah still held the iron pipe, her hands trembling, not from fear, but from the exertion. She watched as one by one the 6 men turned toward her. The sound of the sirens was an alarm of hope, but the distance separating them from help was still an abyss. The semicircle of predators reformed, but this time, the center was no longer the multi-millionaire in a suit. It was a 6-year-old girl, alone under an overpass, with a piece of rusty iron as her only defense against the storm of fury she herself had unleashed. Arthur watched the scene unfold with a horror that chilled his blood. The distance seemed insurmountable. He could scream, run back, but he knew it would be useless. The bikers were faster, stronger, and now consumed by a blind rage. His escape had left her behind, exposed and terrifyingly vulnerable. The flashing lights of the police cars finally appeared at the entrance to the overpass. The red and blue glow swept across the concrete, painting the bikers' faces in ghostly colors. The gang leader shot one last look of pure hatred in Leah's direction. "This ain't over, kid," he snarled, before jumping on his bike. The others followed his lead. The engines roared back to life, a sound of fury and retreat. In seconds, they weaved out from under the overpass, speeding in the opposite direction of the police, and vanished into the city traffic. The silence they left behind was as heavy as the noise they had made. When the officers arrived, they found Arthur, a visibly shaken man in a rumpled, dirt-stained suit, and Leah, a small, motionless figure in the middle of the trash, still clutching the iron pipe with both hands as if it were a scepter. Arthur's story, told between ragged breaths, sounded surreal. A billionaire tycoon, known for his massive financial holdings and near-mythical fortune, attacked under an overpass and saved by a homeless child. The officers exchanged skeptical glances. The scene was bizarre, and the explanation even more so. In the days that followed, Arthur's life became a bureaucratic and emotional labyrinth. He wanted to get Leah out of that place immediately, take her to his home, wrap her in safety and comfort. But the world didn't work with the simplicity of his desires. He was a 50-year-old single man, and she was a minor with no documents or known relatives. Taking her in himself would raise a million red flags for Child Protective Services and the police themselves, who already looked at him with veiled suspicion. "Why would a man like you spend so much time with a street kid?" one detective asked, the implication hanging in the air like cigarette smoke. He hired the best lawyers his money could buy, but even they ran into walls. The system was slow, cautious, and mistrustful. In the meantime, Leah was taken to a temporary shelter, a place that was clean and safe, but impersonal and frightening for a child who had only ever known the brutal freedom of the streets. Arthur visited her every day, but each visit was a reminder of his powerlessness. He could move millions in crypto with a click, but he couldn't speed up the process to protect the girl who had saved his life. The second obstacle, however, was far more immediate and terrifying. On the third night after the incident, as his driver was taking him home, an object hit the armored window of the car with a dull thud. It was a heavy, greasy lug nut, and wrapped around it with a piece of wire was a torn scrap of cardboard. On it, a single sentence was written in crude block letters. "We know where you live." The message was clear. The gang hadn't forgotten him. And if they knew where he lived, they also knew where he worked, the places he frequented. His fortress of wealth and security had been breached. And the threat wasn't just for him. If they could find him, they could, in time, find the girl. The message on the windshield was like a stone thrown into the calm, controlled waters of Arthur's life. The ripples of fear spread through every aspect of his existence. His house, a mansion in a gated community he had always considered an impenetrable sanctuary, suddenly felt vulnerable, its glass walls seeming fragile and exposed. Every car that slowed on the street, every unfamiliar face in the neighborhood became a source of anxiety. He reinforced security, hiring more guards and installing additional cameras, turning his home into a gilded fortress. Yet he knew these were palliative measures. The real threat was not against his assets, but against a life he now felt viscerally responsible for protecting. He tried to maintain his routine, attending meetings about the fluctuating value of his gold and cryptocurrency investments, discussing strategies to increase his business profits, but his mind was elsewhere. It was in the cold shelter where Leah was, or it wandered the dark city streets, imagining the bikers' faces on every corner. The naivety that had led him to believe kindness was a sufficient shield had been shattered. The real world, with its sharp edges and deep-seated resentments, had invaded his sterile world of numbers and profit projections. Meanwhile, the city buzzed with the story. The newspapers, sensing a drama with all the right ingredients, wealth, poverty, violence, and mystery, ran sensationalist headlines. Tycoon attacked under overpass. The mystery girl and the billionaire. Other businessmen, members of his social circle, reacted with a mixture of concern and alarm. At business lunches and meetings at the golf club, it was the only topic of conversation. Most saw him as a victim, but also as reckless. "What were you thinking?" Arthur asked an old friend, the president of a major bank. "Those areas are dangerous. We need more insulation, not more interaction. We need to protect our assets, our families." The push for more private security, for higher walls, and for even greater segregation between the dangerous elements and the city's elite grew, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust. Arthur felt suffocated by this mentality, the same one that he, in his own bubble, had inadvertently fueled for years. But his greatest torment was Leah's safety. The shelter was secure, but it wasn't a fortress. 3 days after the warning on his car, his worst fear began to materialize. During his daily visit, one of the shelter's caregivers pulled him aside, her face pale with worry. "Mr. Sterling, something strange happened today," she said in a low voice. "2 men on a motorcycle were parked across the street for nearly an hour, just watching the gate. When our security guard went to approach them, they sped off." Arthur's heart stopped. It was them. Somehow, they had tracked her. He felt a wave of icy panic. They were hunting her. The humiliation they suffered under the overpass demanded revenge, and Leah was the easiest target, the symbol of their defeat. Her courage had transformed her from an invisible child into a target. He knew he had to act, and fast. The bureaucracy, the police, the lawyers, it was all too slow. The threat was real, immediate, and closing in with every passing hour. As he looked through the shelter window and saw Leah drawing at a table, completely oblivious to the danger circling her, a terrible and risky decision began to form in his mind. He would have to get her out of there himself before it was too late. The decision burned in Arthur's mind like a live coal. Logic, prudence, and the advice of his lawyers screamed for him to trust the system, not to take any rash action that could be construed as a crime. But instinct, the image of those men on a motorcycle watching the shelter, spoke louder. He couldn't wait. With every minute Leah spent in that place, the target on her back grew larger. He spent the night awake, pacing his lavish office, the glow from the stock market tickers illuminating his anguished face. For the first time in his life, his immense fortune felt more like a burden than a solution. It attracted attention, created resentment, and now it prevented him from acting like an ordinary human being, from simply taking a child in danger and bringing her somewhere safe. He needed information. Who were these men? What motivated them beyond a diffuse anger against the rich? Understanding the enemy was the first principle of any negotiation, any business acquisition. He used his resources not to move capital, but to gain knowledge. He hired a private investigator, a discreet and efficient ex-cop, with the mission of identifying the gang's leader. He gave the man the only clue he had, the scene under the overpass, the accusation that he built his wealth on the ruins of other people. "Look for someone who was directly affected by my companies," Arthur instructed, a bitter taste in his mouth. The answer came in less than 48 hours, and it was like a punch to the gut. The investigator delivered a thin but devastating file. The gang leader's name was Marcos, and his name was in the employment records of one of Arthur's largest holdings, a steel mill that had undergone a massive restructuring 5 years earlier. The word restructuring was a corporate euphemism for mass layoffs. To maintain profitability and satisfy shareholders who demanded ever-increasing dividends, hundreds of workers had been let go. Marcos was one of them. He had been a shift supervisor, an employee with 20 years at the company, loyal and dedicated. His termination had sent him into a downward spiral. He lost his house, his wife left him, and he ended up deep in a world of precarious odd jobs and growing resentment. The men who followed him were, for the most part, former colleagues, men who shared the same story of disillusionment. Arthur sat in his leather chair, the report trembling in his hands. The attack hadn't been random. It wasn't just about social inequality in the abstract. It was personal. He wasn't just a symbol of the economic elite. To Marcos, he was the face, the name, the direct cause of his life's destruction. The man's rage wasn't just ideological. It was an open, festering wound. This discovery changed everything. This was no longer a group of generic criminals. It was a group of desperate men, led by someone who saw him as a personal arch-nemesis. And this new perspective made the threat to Leah even more grave and imminent. She wasn't just a witness or collateral damage. She was the perfect weapon to hurt him where it mattered most. Her courage had saved him, and now, by a terrible irony of fate, that same courage had linked her to a conflict far older and deeper than any of them could have imagined. The revelation about Marcos hit Arthur with the force of a collision. He spent hours reviewing the details of the steel mill's restructuring, an event that, at the time, had been just another strategic decision in his vast business empire. He remembered the spreadsheets, the profit projection charts, the board meetings. He remembered signing the papers that sealed the fates of hundreds of families as if he were signing any other check. Back then, the names on the layoff list were just that. Names. Numbers on a balance sheet that needed to be squared away. Now, one of those names had a face, a voice, and a deep, justified hatred aimed directly at him. Guilt gnawed at him, an unfamiliar and uncomfortable sensation. His fortune, built on a foundation of cold, calculated decisions, suddenly felt tainted. This new understanding amplified his fear for Leah. The pursuit wasn't just impulsive retaliation. It was a calculated revenge. Marcos didn't just want to scare him. He wanted to destroy him in the same way he felt he had been destroyed. And what better way to break a man who seemed to have everything by taking from him the one thing his money couldn't easily buy or protect, the safety of a helpless child he had grown to care for. The plan to get Leah out of the shelter himself, once a desperate idea, now became an urgent necessity. He could no longer afford to wait. Yet, every step he took was being watched. He knew the bikers might be watching not only the shelter but him as well. Any suspicious move could precipitate action on their part. He felt trapped in a web where every thread he pulled to free himself only seemed to tighten the knot around Leah. His relationship with the girl was also deepening, making the dilemma even more painful. In their daily visits, he began to see beyond the resilient street kid. He saw a curious mind that asked questions about the colors of the trees and the shapes of the clouds. He saw a sweetness hidden beneath layers of distrust, which revealed itself in a rare, small smile when he brought her a coloring book or a piece of chocolate. She began to talk more, sharing fragments of her life under the overpass, not with self-pity, but with the matter-of-factness of someone describing the only world she'd ever known. The connection between them strengthened with each passing day, transforming Arthur's sense of responsibility into a genuine, deep affection. He was no longer just trying to save the girl who saved him. He was trying to protect the child who was slowly carving out a space in his heart. This growing emotional bond was his strength, but also his greatest weakness. Marcos somehow seemed to sense this. The surveillance grew bolder. One day, leaving the shelter, Arthur saw one of the gang's bikes parked at the end of the street. The rider didn't hide his face. He just stared at him for a long moment, a cold, promising look, before revving the engine and disappearing. It was a psychological game, a war of nerves. They were showing him they could get close whenever they wanted. They were testing his limits, waiting for him to make a mistake. And Arthur knew that, under this relentless pressure, with fear and guilt eroding his reason, a mistake was becoming more and more likely. With every visit, saying goodbye became harder, the feeling of leaving her behind, a bait in a trap, almost unbearable. The question was no longer if they would act, but when. The pressure became suffocating. The city, once a playground for his business and investments, now felt like a hostile arena. The social subplot unfolding in parallel to his personal drama only added more fuel to the fire. The incident at the overpass had become a catalyst for a city-wide debate on inequality. On one side, his peers, the titans of industry and finance, called for more crackdowns and insulation. They demanded the city clean up the downtown areas, increasing police presence and creating exclusion zones for the homeless population. They saw the attack on Arthur not as a symptom of a deep social problem, but as a simple matter of crime and disorder that needed to be crushed with an iron fist. On the other side, social activists and the more critical media outlets used the case to expose the city's open wounds. They pointed to economic policies that benefited a handful of billionaires while leaving a trail of unemployment and despair. Arthur Sterling's name, once synonymous with success and wealth, was now frequently cited as an example of the social abyss. He found himself caught in the crossfire, criticized by both sides. To his wealthy friends, he was the reckless one who was asking for trouble. To his critics, he was the hypocrite trying to ease his conscience with charitable gestures while his empire continued to perpetuate inequality. This polarization made everything more difficult. The police, pressured from both sides, began to investigate Arthur himself more intensely. His relationship with Leah was the focal point of their suspicion. A particularly cynical detective named Harding called him in for another statement. "Mr. Sterling," Harding said, his tone bordering on accusatory, "it's unusual, to say the least, for a man of your net worth to develop such an intense interest in a homeless child. You understand how that looks to us." The questions were insinuating, probing for ulterior motives, for some dark involvement beyond altruism. Arthur felt violated, his purest intention being twisted and stained by suspicion. Amid this storm, the inevitable second major twist occurred. It was on a rainy Thursday. Arthur was in a tense meeting with his lawyers, discussing the latest police subpoenas, when his personal cell phone rang. It was an unknown number. He answered, and the voice on the other end was the one he dreaded most. Marcos's. The voice was calm, almost courteous, which made it all the more terrifying. "Good afternoon, Mr. Sterling. Hope I'm not interrupting any big stock trades or anything." "What do you want?" Arthur replied, his body going rigid. "What do I want? Justice. But for now we'll settle for a chat. You see, your little starlight was missing the fresh air. The shelter is so grey. We decided to take her for a walk." The floor seemed to vanish from under Arthur's feet. An icy cold shot up his spine. "Where is she if you touch one hair on her head?" he threatened, his voice failing. Marcos laughed, a humorless sound. "Threats don't suit you, Sterling. You're a businessman. So let's do business. You want to see her again? Come to the abandoned steel mill, the same one you kicked us out of. Come alone, and come now. We're waiting." The line went dead. The silence in the room was absolute. His lawyers stared at him, stunned. The nightmare had become real. They had her, and they were luring him into a trap, using the most precious bait of his life. The abandoned steel mill was a mausoleum of metal and memory. Arthur knew the place, but from a completely different perspective. Years ago, he had toured it in a hard hat, a clipboard in hand, discussing cash flow optimization and productivity gains with engineers. Now, he approached on foot, alone, the sound of his expensive shoes echoing in an eerie silence. The place stank of rust, old oil, and the despair of hundreds of broken lives. It was the perfect stage for Marcos's revenge. The police were a problem. His lawyers insisted he contact them, but Marcos's demand had been clear: come alone. Arthur knew that a police presence could turn a kidnapping into a tragedy. They might come in with guns blazing, and Leah would be in the middle. Besides, Detective Harding's suspicion haunted him. What if the police thought he was involved, that this was all some bizarre plot to gain custody of the girl? Bureaucracy and suspicion had become obstacles as dangerous as the gang itself. He was cornered, forced to play Marcos's game on Marcos's terms. To make matters worse, the media had caught wind of the new development. A leak from inside the police or the shelter had tipped off reporters about Leah's disappearance. Within hours, the story exploded. The narrative became a national scandal, billionaire at center of child abduction. The headlines were cruel, the speculation venomous. They openly questioned why a rich, powerful man was involved with a street child, painting a dark, distorted portrait of his intentions. He was portrayed as a dangerous eccentric, a predator, or, at best, a reckless fool whose wealth had blinded him to reality. His reputation, built over decades of hard work and shrewd investments, was being dismantled in real time. Every article, every online comment was a stab at his integrity. He knew he was walking into a trap. His mind, trained to calculate risks and predict outcomes, screamed that this was a terrible move, a willing surrender to the enemy. But his heart gave him no choice. The image of Leah, small and scared, in some dark corner of that mill, erased every other consideration. His love for her had become a liability on his emotional balance sheet, a vulnerability that Marcos was exploiting with surgical precision. As he pushed open the heavy metal door of the warehouse, the groan of protest shattered the stillness. The faint light filtering through broken windows revealed the silhouettes of dormant machines, sleeping giants covered in dust. And in the center of the vast space, the 6 bikers waited for him. Marcos was sitting on a wooden crate, and next to him, tied to a chair with rope that looked too big for her small body, was Leah. Her eyes were wide with fear, but when she saw him, a flicker of relief crossed her face. She was unharmed, for now. "Welcome back to your kingdom." "Sterling," Marcos said, standing up. His voice echoed in the empty warehouse, "like what we've done with the place. We left it just as you gave it to us, empty and lifeless." Arthur ignored the taunt. His eyes were locked on Leah. "Let her go," he said, his voice firm despite the fear twisting his insides. "I'm here. Your problem is with me. Let her go." Marcos smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Ah, but that's where you're wrong. She's not just the bait, she's part of it. You don't know, do you? Life is full of surprises, Sterling, especially when you stop paying attention to the little people. He paused dramatically, savoring the moment. Did you really think we found her by chance? Marcos's question hung in the stagnant air of the warehouse, thick and laden with a meaning Arthur couldn't decipher. His mind, accustomed to analyzing data and identifying patterns, searched for a logical explanation. Was it a bluff, an attempt to destabilize him further? He took a step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, his voice echoing his confusion. Whatever it is, we can solve it. Money. I'll give you whatever you want. A new start for you and your men. An investment for a business. Just name the price and let the girl go. Marcos let out a short, bitter laugh. An explosion of contempt. Money? That's always your answer for everything, isn't it? Think a little of your capital can erase what you did. You signed a piece of paper in your ivory tower and sentenced hundreds of families. Do you remember my brother, Sterling? His name was Roberto. He worked on the assembly line, an honest man who just wanted to give his family a decent life. Arthur searched his memory but found nothing. There were so many names, so many lives reduced to lines on a cost-cutting spreadsheet. Marcus's face contorted in pain. Of course you don't remember. He was just another number to be cut. When you laid him off, you broke his spirit. He tried. He looked for other jobs. But the city was dying, poisoned by your decisions. He lost hope. He lost everything. Marcus's voice cracked for an instant, the armor of rage splitting to reveal the wound beneath. He couldn't take it. He left his daughter behind and just disappeared. Abandoned his own child because he couldn't look at her anymore without feeling the shame of his failure. A knot of dread began to form in Arthur's throat. The story was tragic, another weight on his conscience. But he still didn't see the final connection, the piece that would complete this horrifying puzzle. Leah, in the chair, looked from one man to the other. She didn't understand investment or spreadsheet, but she understood the pain in the voice of the man holding her captive and the growing panic on the face of the man who visited her. "Why are you telling me this?" Arthur asked, his voice nearly a whisper. Marcos took a step toward Leah, placing a heavy hand on the girl's shoulder. She flinched at his touch. He looked directly into Arthur's eyes, and it was in that moment that the truth, the most devastating and cruel truth of all, was revealed. I'm telling you this, Sterling, because the daughter my brother abandoned, the girl who ended up under your damned overpass, living off the scraps your city left behind, that's her. He squeezed Leah's shoulder lightly. This is my niece, your little starlight, the living proof of what your wealth cost my family. Arthur's world disintegrated. The air was sucked from his lungs. It wasn't a random kidnapping. It wasn't a chase for revenge. It was a family drama of which he was the unwitting architect. Every sandwich he had given, every smile he had received, every moment of connection was now tainted by this terrible truth. He wasn't a benefactor. He was the original cause of the suffering he had been trying to alleviate. The irony was so cruel, so absolute, it knocked the ground from beneath him. He looked at Leah, at those eyes that held a universe of resilience, and saw for the first time the legacy of his corporate decisions. She wasn't a stranger he had saved. She was a consequence. Now you understand? Marcos said, his voice low and charged with a dark triumph. Your net worth can't fix this, but you can. You're going to give us the only thing that really matters, a life for the life you destroyed. The weight of the revelation crushed Arthur. Each breath was a struggle, as if the air in the warehouse had solidified. He looked at Leah, no longer as starlight, but as the epicenter of a tragedy he himself had set in motion years ago with the stroke of a pen. His obsession with protecting her, his feelings of affection, all reconfigured under the light of this new, terrible truth. He wasn't a hero saving a victim. He was the villain of the story trying, belatedly, to fix an irreparable mistake. Guilt was a poison, and he felt he deserved to drink every last drop. "You're right," Arthur said, his voice low and hoarse. His surrender was total. The fight had drained from his body, replaced by a heavy resignation. A life for the one I destroyed. "It's fair. What do you want me to do?" Marco seemed surprised by the quick acceptance, but his face quickly hardened back into a mask of cold determination. "I don't want your dirty money, Sterling. I want your soul. I want the world to see you the way I see you." He pulled a cell phone from his pocket, the small device looking like a weapon in his hand. "You're going to record a video, a confession. You're going to tell everyone how, in the name of profit and shareholder value, you destroyed the mill, threw hundreds of family men onto the street, and broke my brother. You will admit your fortune was built on the misery of others. And then you will transfer control of your companies to a trust managed by the former employees. You're going to give it all away." It was complete destruction, not of his physical life, but of everything he was, his name, his reputation, his legacy. He would become a pariah, the poster boy for corporate greed, and strangely, he felt it was what he deserved. He looked at Leah, at her frightened eyes, and nodded slowly. "I'll do it." As Marco started the camera, dictating the first humiliating words for Arthur to repeat, the attention of the other bikers was fixed on the central drama. They savored the fall of the Titan, the poetic justice of the situation, but they had forgotten about the girl in the chair. Leah didn't understand the meaning of trust or shareholders, but she understood the defeat on Arthur's face. She saw the glowing device in her uncle's hand and the tone of his voice. The same tone he had used before, threatening to throw Arthur from the overpass. The good man was giving up because of her, and that, in her small universe of fierce loyalties, was unacceptable. Her eyes scanned her surroundings. Behind her chair, stacked precariously against a wall, was a pile of thin, rusted steel plates, leftovers from the factory's former production. They were unstable, balanced like a metallic house of cards. With her hands still tied, she began to move her body, a subtle, almost imperceptible rocking. First forward, then back, using the weight of the chair. The men were mesmerized by Arthur's confession as he began to speak in the monotone of a condemned man. Leah increased her rhythm, an inch, two. The back leg of the chair touched the base of the metal stack. With one last, desperate push, she threw her entire weight backward. The result was deafening. The stack of steel plates collapsed with a cataclysmic crash, a thunder of metal that shook the warehouse. The plates cascaded down, slamming into each other in a symphony of chaos, kicking up a thick cloud of dust and rust. The noise was so violent and unexpected that everyone, including Marcos, spun around, instinctively shielding themselves from what sounded like a structural collapse. For 2 crucial seconds, their attention was diverted, and it was all Arthur needed. Adrenaline hit him like a lightning bolt. He didn't think, he acted. In one fluid motion, he lunged toward Leah, snapping the old rope that bound her with a savage pull. He scooped her into his arms and ran for the only exit he saw, a rusted side door, slightly ajar, that led into the blackness of the night. Marcos's shouts of fury echoed behind them as they plunged into uncertainty, the sound of the gang's heavy footsteps already in pursuit. The escape through the abandoned industrial labyrinth was a blur of fear and adrenaline. Arthur ran with Leah in his arms, his heart hammering against his ribs, the sound of his own ragged breaths mixing with the enraged shouts of Marcos and his men. Every shadow seemed like an enemy. Every sound of metal groaning in the wind seemed to herald their capture. He didn't know where he was going, only away from the light of the main warehouse, plunging deeper into the forgotten complex. Leah's weight, though slight, began to burn in his muscles, but the feeling of her small body clinging to his neck was the only fuel driving him forward. Finally, he found a small office, its door ajar. He slipped inside and closed it gently, the soft click of the latch sounding like a gunshot in the silence. The room was small, claustrophobic, filled with broken furniture and papers scattered across the floor. Yellowed with age, he set Leah down and crouched beside her, placing a finger to his lips. Outside, they could hear the bikers' footsteps splitting up, their voices echoing through the metal hallways. They were being hunted. In this temporary, fragile refuge, the climax of the chase gave way to an emotional one. Leah was trembling, not from cold, but from shock. Arthur hugged her, wrapping her in his expensive and now torn suit jacket. "You saved me again." "Starlight," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She looked up at him, her eyes large and serious in the gloom. "You were giving up," she answered, her voice small but firm. "You were going to let the bad man win." In that moment, Arthur understood. True wealth wasn't in his holdings, his assets, or his net worth. It was right here, in this act of unshakable courage, in this pure loyalty. He had surrendered, accepted the guilt. But Leah, in her fierce innocence, refused to accept defeat. She didn't see him as the cause of her misfortune, but as the good man who brought her food and smiles. Her view of him redeemed him. The office door burst open with a crash, and Marcos stood in the doorway, his face twisted with fury. But the sight that met his eyes made him pause. Arthur was no longer cowering in guilt. He stood up, placing himself protectively in front of Leah. "Enough, Marcos," Arthur said, his voice calm and filled with a new authority. "You're right. I was wrong. My decisions, made from miles away, destroyed your family. And for that, I am sorry. A guilt I will carry forever. But looking at Leah has made me understand something. You can blame me for what happened to your brother, but you are the only one responsible for what you are doing to his daughter right now. You kidnapped her, terrified her, used her as a weapon. You're becoming the monster you believe I am." The words hit Marcos like a physical blow. He looked at Leah, huddled behind Arthur, and for the first time, the rage in his eyes gave way to a flicker of doubt, of pain. "I didn't want," he began, his voice faltering. "I know," Arthur interrupted gently. "You just wanted justice, and you'll have it, but not like this." At that moment, distant sirens began to wail, rapidly approaching. Arthur had managed to discreetly dial 911 while he was running. "I'm not going to press kidnapping charges," Arthur said quickly. "I'll say we came here to talk, but in return, you and your men need to accept my help. Not as charity, but as an investment. I'm going to reopen this factory, and you are going to run it. Not for me, but for yourselves, for your families, for your brother's memory." The proposal was so unexpected, so radical. It left Marcos speechless. The sirens were almost on top of them. A decision had to be made in seconds. The other bikers appeared behind Marcos, confused. "It's a chance, Marcos," Arthur said. "A second chance for all of us." When the police stormed the building, they found a bizarre scene. A billionaire, a child, and a group of bikers standing in a tense silence. True to his word, Arthur de-escalated the situation, claiming it was a meeting to discuss a business proposal. It was a difficult victory, bought with the public humiliation that still awaited him, but it was a victory. He had turned enemies into potential partners, and the cycle of revenge had been broken. In the following weeks, the bureaucracy of gaining temporary custody of Leah was a new battlefield. But now, with the police seeing him in a new light and the media scandal slowly turning into a story of redemption, doors began to open. Finally, after hearings and evaluations, a judge granted Arthur provisional guardianship, recognizing the girl's need for protection and stability. Walking out of the courthouse with Leah holding his hand, Arthur felt he had acquired the most precious asset of his entire life, 3 weeks. That's how long it took for the world to turn upside down and then find a new axis. The morning sun streamed through the living room window of Arthur's mansion, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The home's silence, once a mark of opulent loneliness, was now filled with new sounds. The scribble of a crayon on paper, the patter of small feet on the marble floors, and occasionally a clear, crystalline laugh. Leah was home. She attended a small private school nearby, learning to read and write, discovering a universe previously denied to her. At night, Arthur read her stories before she slept, tales of magical worlds and happy endings that he himself was beginning to believe were possible. The final victory, official adoption, would still take months, maybe a year, of legal proceedings, but it was a certainty. The man who once saw the world through spreadsheets of interest and dividends now measured his wealth in smiles and clumsy hugs. The transformation in his personal life spilled over into his professional one. True to his promise, Arthur began the project of reopening the old steel mill. It wasn't an act of charity, but a new business model. He established a cooperative, offering shares to the former employees, including Marcos and his men, making them partners in the venture. The initial capital came from his own fortune, an investment many of his colleagues in the financial world deemed madness, a low-return application. But for Arthur, profitability was now measured differently. Marcos, distrustful at first, slowly began to embrace the opportunity. The rage that had consumed him gave way to a sense of purpose. He still carried the pain of his brother's loss, but now he channeled that energy into building something new, a legacy for his family and the families of his friends. He visited Leah occasionally, supervised meetings filled with an awkward tenderness. He was learning to be the uncle he never had a chance to be, and Leah, with the infinite resilience of children, was learning to forgive. The story, which had begun as a tabloid scandal, became a modern parable about redemption and social responsibility. Arthur didn't become a saint, but he learned that the true legacy he would leave behind would not be his fortune in dollars, but the bridges he built over the chasms he himself had helped create. He realized that privilege was not a shield to isolate oneself from the world, but a tool to transform it. The greatest lesson of his journey came not from economics textbooks or stock market gurus, but from a 6-year-old girl who, armed with an iron pipe and infinite courage, taught him the true value of things. On that sunny afternoon, 3 weeks after the terror under the overpass, Arthur watched Leah in the garden, chasing a butterfly. She was no longer the still, silent girl he had met. She was a vibrant child, full of life and hope. The child who had lived under an overpass had discovered that her bravery could move mountains and change lives, including her own. And the man who was nearly thrown from that same overpass, the multi-millionaire who symbolized inequality, became an example that sometimes the greatest lessons in humanity come from the smallest hearts. He smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile. His life, once a predictable cash flow, was now unpredictable, messy, and infinitely richer.